Okay, so let's start with the TimeZone class because we're going to need it for the account class. So here I'm going to basically create a class that's going to have two instance attributes, the offset and the name. So the actual properties of the class, there's only two, the name and the actual offset. And I'm going to use a time delta object to represent the offset in terms of hours and minutes. But that's not what I'm going to pass in to the init of this class. I'm going to pass in the name, yes, and I'm going to pass in the minute and hour offsets individually, and then I'll store them and combine them in terms of the property offset. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm also going to want to do a little bit of validation here and there. Not a lot, it can certainly be expanded, but I am going to check to make sure that we're passing in integer numbers for the hour and offset values. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to need to import the numbers class, and then from date time, I'm going to import time delta. Okay, we're going to need that to define our class. So let's go ahead and create the class. So I'm going to call it TimeZone. And let's do the init first. So for the init, we're going to pass in the name of the time zone. We're going to pass in the offset hours and the offset minutes. And I'm going to just store those in the class. But before I do that, I'm going to do a little bit of validation. So first of all is, I don't want the name to be empty. I want the name to be passed, and I don't want it to be an empty string either. So if name is none, so if it wasn't provided or it was set to none, or given that now it is not none, I can make a string out of it. I can strip out any spaces to the left and to the right, and I can look at the length of that. And if the length of that is 0, then I have a problem because that's not a valid name. I don't want to have an empty name for the time zone. So I'm going to raise a value error. So we'll raise a value error and we'll just say here, time zone name cannot be empty. Okay. And let me fix my typo. So that's that one. That's one thing. And if that works, then I'll store the name. And here, well, I'm going to stringify the name and I'm going to strip as well. So I'm going to kind of normalize my data as I save it. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to validate that offset hours and offset minutes are integer numbers. That's the first thing. So if not is instance, and we'll start with offset hours first and then numbers.integral. So that's why I imported that module. If it's not an integral number, then I'm also going to raise a value error. And I'll specify here the hour offset must be an integer. Okay, so that's my first test. I'm also going to do the same test for the offset minutes. So if not is instance offset minutes, and again numbers dot integral, and then I'm basically going to return the same kind of error, and we'll check value error and we'll say the minute offset must be an integer. Okay. Now there's also a few other things too that I want to check, that I can check. Here, for example, the offset minutes. Well, I shouldn't be specifying more than 59 or negative 59, less than negative 59 for the minutes, right? That's going to be my limit. So if my offset minutes is greater than 59 or offset minutes is less than negative 59, and I could have done this other ways. I could have checked if the absolute value of offset minutes is greater than 59, but I'll just do it this way. And here I'm going to raise again a value error. So the minutes offset must be between negative 59 and 59 inclusive, right? We're actually inclusive of the endpoints here. Okay, so now that we have that, we can look at the offset. Now there's another check that I want to do. Technically, when you're dealing with time zone offsets, the smallest offset you can have is negative 12 hours and 0 minutes, and the largest offset that you can have is 14 hours and 0 minutes. But I can't just check that the hours, right, is between -12 and 14, because I can check -12 with the minutes equal to 0 and then 14 with the minutes equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create the offset. So I'm going to say the offset. I'm not storing that in the class at this point. I'm just creating a local variable, and I'm going to create this time delta. And I'm going to set the hours equal to the offset hours and the minutes equal to the offset minutes. Okay, so now I have a time delta, and now that's very easy to check to make sure that I'm within the -12 and 14. So I can say if offset is less than, so I'm going to create a time delta object here saying hours equals -12, minutes equals 0. Okay, so if I'm less than that, that's going to be wrong. Or the offset is greater than a time delta, and here I'm going to specify my hours equal to 14 and my minutes equal to 0. So if that's the case, right, then I have a problem. My offset is too big or too small. So I'm going to raise a value error again. So all this so far is basically just, trying to make sure that our users are passing us correct or valid data. And of course, that always becomes a discussion on, do you guard against everything, or do you just, let things fail and then handle the failures? I kind of take an in-between approach. There are certain things that I guard against. For example, making sure that this is a valid offset for the time zone, right? Python isn't going to catch that for me. If I specified an offset of -100 hours, the program will run very happily. So those are kinds of things that I need to check, right? But checking whether something's an integer or whether you passed in a list when it was supposed to be a string, yeah, maybe not. Those are kinds of things that I usually will let the code flow through. I mean, that's the whole idea of Python, right? Is that it can handle, polymorphic attributes. So it knows how to add two objects that are of different types. It knows how to add two integers, but it also knows how to add two strings. So very often the code we write can work equally well with the different data types, and we don't have to catch those ahead of time. We can just let it flow through, and then if there is an exception, then we need to do exception handling. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that for the validation. So if I pass this set of validations, I'm good enough. And I'm going to create now a set of private, right, pseudo-private variables, because I just want to keep track of what did I use to create, to instantiate this class, right, to initialize this class. So I'm going to do that. Offset minutes equals offset minutes, but I'm not going to give that back to the user. What I am going to do is write a property for the offset itself. So I'm going to store it locally, and I will make it a read-only property. So again, of course, nothing is read-only in Python, but I am going to make it into a property, and I will only define the getter method. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and create that property. So we'll call the property offset, and it is going to return self offset, okay, underscore offset. It's just going to return that. So that's the offset property. I'm also going to make a property for the name, right? So again, a read-only property. So I'm not going to define a setter. So it's just going to return self._name. Now, the other thing too that I want to do, and we'll talk about this later as well, but we really should be defining equality. I may want to be able to compare two time zones to see if they're equal. Well, what is it for those two time zones to be equal? They have to have the same name, and they have to have the same offset. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to define the equals method, and we'll basically say, okay, what does it mean for two things to be equal? Well, first of all, they have to be both time zone objects, right? So I could write an if statement, but really what I want to check is the following. I want to check, is this an instance, is other an instance of time zone? Okay, if that's true, and self.name is equal to the other dot name, and self dot, and I can compare the offset hours and the offset minutes separately like so. So I'll do it this way. We could also just use the offset itself, but I'm going to use this. So other underscore offset hours and self underscore offset minutes equals other underscore offset minutes. Okay, if that's the case, then I need to return true. If any of those fail, I need to return false. So all I need to do here is just basically say return. So now let me just fix up the indentation. Like so. So this is my equality. Okay. Now technically, if I want time zones to be usable as keys, right, because I've defined this dunder equal method, I would also have to define the dunder hash method. At this point, I've defined an equal method. I haven't defined what the hash is. At this point, this class is no longer hashable. But I don't need to for now. I'm not going to do it. So I'm not going to create a hash method, but I am going to create a wrapper, a representation method. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'll explain the difference between representation and strings, right, in next section. So for now, I'm going to return, and I'm going to use string interpolation. So I'm going to use an F string. And what do I want to return? Well, this is a time zone object. Okay, it has a name equal to, and I'll put the name in single quotes since it's supposed to be a string. Then it has to have offset hours, because remember, this is how we are creating the class. So we need to pass it the offset hours, and then we need to pass it the offset minutes, like so. Okay. So the name here, well, I need to interpolate in there self.name. For the offset hours, I just need to interpolate self underscore offset hours. And for the minutes, so this is why I used an expression, used a parenthesis, so I can do this over multiple lines. So let's close that off. This is how we continue. And then I'll do the same thing here, and like so. So now I've got self dot underscore offset hours, and here we'll do self dot underscore offset minutes. Okay, and that's our wrapper. And I just need to fix my syntax. Where am I? Line 6. If name is none. So where is that? If name is none or that equals equals. Use the double equals. Mistype that. Okay. So this is our time zone class. Now let's try it out and make sure it's working. And again, these are just like manual tests. Ideally, you want to start writing unit tests at this point. You don't want to leave your unit tests till the end. I'm going to do that for this project, and you're going to see that it's very tedious going back and writing a proper testing framework for our code. So let's go ahead and create a time zone instance. Now for the time zone, I need to specify, let's say, the name of the time zone, ABC, maybe -2 hours and -15 minutes. Okay. So I can do that. I can then look at the name. That's great. Now let me go ahead and do a test with the offset. So from date time, I'm going to import date time. I'm going to need that. And I'm going to make dt equal to the date time.utc now. Okay. So now my date time is basically my current time. So if I look at what dt is, this is my current time. Or I can just print it if I want a better representation of it, or a more human readable representation of it. Okay, so now this is my time. This is what dt is. Now I know that if I add my offset from this time zone to this, it should decrease the hours by 2 and decrease the minutes by 5. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say print dt plus tz1 dot offset. And as you can see, my hours was decreased by 2 and my minutes was decreased by 15, right? 57 minus 15 is 42. So that seems to be working fine. And of course, if we try, let's say, and say tz equals time zone, and then we'll pass in an empty string, right? And then here it doesn't matter, we can pass in 0, 0, so technically that's going to be UTC. And then let's go ahead and trap a value error as that, and let's just print the exception when it happens. And you can see we do get the value error, and the error message is that the time zone name cannot be empty. So if we do this, ABC, and we try and put in, let's say, 18 hours, then we should also get a value error that tells us that the offset must be -12 or +14. And here I'm at +18, which is obviously too small. Oh, too large, sorry. All right, that's the time zone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.